Let me paint a picture for you. You're out at a busy restaurant, trying to enjoy a nice meal. Waiters are moving to and fro. You can see the flames of the stove in the back. There's music playing over the speakers that some staff member has turned up too high. And there's a general hum as people converse, clink knife and fork against plate. And right next to you is a young family, a mum, a dad, and a young kid. And they're trying to enjoy a nice night out, just like you. The only problem is this kid can't settle. Maybe they don't go out that much. Maybe the kid's just not used to a restaurant. Whatever the case, this little kid's moaning and groaning. They're whinging about this, that, or the other thing. And you can tell the mum and dad are trying to make the best of it. Enjoy their one night out, but they're really struggling. Finally, after some time, the mum, exasperated, reaches into her purse and pulls out the iPad. With a defeated sigh, she hands it over to the kid, who eagerly grabs it as if it's the last iPad in the entire world. Then, the kid settles down, flicking from this video to that, and they're quiet. But you can tell the mum and dad aren't happy about this. They've bought 10, maybe 15 minutes of peace, but at what cost? Today, we're going to be talking about how to media-proof your kids. There's much at stake when it comes to raising your children. Every parent worries about the media their kids are consuming, whether on YouTube, Netflix, TV, or any other part of the internet. And likewise, every family has their own rules about what media can be watched and for how long. And if you're a parent, one of the most pressing questions that you ask yourself and your spouse daily is probably, are we getting this right? Are we protecting our kids adequately against the dangerous stuff that they might find online? Are we setting a good example for them in the kind of media that we consume? And are the media habits that our children are forming healthy? It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the sheer enormity of the task parents face. Today we're talking to filmmaker and media critic Mark Hadley. Mark is a friend of the podcast and has appeared many times before. He reviews TV and films for us, and occasionally we get to talk to him about those films. But today it's a little different. We're talking about media in general. Mark is a dad, and his kids have grown up saturated in the world of media. It's a little hard to escape when both your parents are in the industry. And so that begs the question, what does a media critic that is a Christian, by the way, think about raising kids to become responsible consumers of media? Well, let's find out today. This is Science Radio, episode 204, How to Media-Proof Your Kids. Hello and welcome to another episode of Science Radio. My name's Jesse and I am honoured to be joined once again by friend of the show, Mark Hadley. Hello, Mark.
Hey, Jesse. Thanks very much. Honoured. It makes me sound elderly. I'm glad I can be part of the show.
You're one of our venerable authors. And
even worse. Okay.
I'm going to stop now. No, I must admit, Mark, I have to restrain myself from every time I see you to pull out the line from The Room, Tommy Wiseau. Oh, hi, Mark. It's a ridiculous reference that my friends and I just absolutely quoted to each other over and over when we were teenagers. That's not got to do with anything. Today,
no,
we're going to be talking.
Actually, it's got a lot. It's got a lot to do with our topic because if I understand, our topic today is how the media shapes you, and you're confessing to being shaped by a particular media product right there.
You know what? You're absolutely right. I hadn't even thought about it that way, but it's so true. Pop culture shapes us in all sorts of ways, and I guess that's a perfect, point of how that actually happens without us knowing. So there you go. So yes, we're talking about how to media-proof your kids. And I think that this is a topic that is not just pertinent for parents, though it certainly is pertinent for parents, but it's also, I think, pertinent for any of us who want to navigate the world of media and not be sucked in by a lot of the somewhat harmful messaging that can come across and can shape us. I think. Would you agree? Maybe this is a good way of starting the conversation. Media shapes us one way or the other. Is there any escaping the way that media shapes us in the world that we live in today? Can we avoid it? Is that even possible?
Well, if we've been trying to avoid it, we've been doing an awful job of it, because our culture, going back several thousand years, has been shaped by story. In fact, story is telling stories is what it is to be human in one respect. We live out our stories, we share our stories, we learn from the stories of others, and the media is ultimately is a platform for stories. So we're shaped by the content. And I would say, in answer to your question, that really you're going to be shaped. You're either going to be shaped consciously or unconsciously. And what we're talking about today is trying to move that shaping into a conscious space so we see what's going on around us, and more importantly, that we try and take steps to make that shaping process one which we're happy with rather than something we regret.
Let's talk about the function of stories. Stories seem to have been in many ways weaponized by powerful people in order to project or to communicate certain messages. I think a lot of us love to sit down to a film or a TV show or play a video game or read a book for pure entertainment value. And some of those pieces of media are designed just to entertain us. But at the same time, a lot of those pieces of media are designed to communicate a message, to shape us in specific ways. As a media critic, as an expert in the field, as a filmmaker, how do you see the way that media is being used, especially by massive production companies, media execs, to communicate how a story is being used to influence culture in our day and age?
Yeah, I think your choice of words, how the media weaponizes stories, is an interesting one, because I think that in some respects, we're talking from a Christian perspective, we are past masters of weaponizing stories too. Jesus weaponized stories. His parables had points to make, and he shaped his stories carefully to do so. I possibly want to begin by saying that stories are effective ways of communicating social mores, moral lessons, things like that. They are weapons. And anybody who doubts that from a Christian perspective should look back in the Old Testament, where Nathan, the prophet, talks to David, King David, after he's sinned with Bathsheba, and tells a story to convict the king of his guilt. So stories have that power because they tap into worldviews. So everybody has a worldview, which is literally, we're not being tricky here with the language. It's just the way you see the world and what you consider to be right and wrong. And so every scriptwriter, being by definition a human being, even though you might meet some of them and go, why did they do that? Every scriptwriter, every producer has a worldview. So some of them are ones that we gel with easily. One of the more standard arcs to a script is the heroic arc. And that's which we see someone triumph over adversity and learn some powerful life lesson from that process. Actually, in the trade, it's called the life lesson script. We don't have a problem with that so long as we agree with the life lesson. So if we want to talk about the fact that self-sacrifice is worthwhile and in fact something we should aspire to for the sake of other people, there's any number of Hollywood films out there, beginning with The Princess Bride and coming forward, that talks about the fact that love should be self-sacrificing. And that is in fact how we know the depth of love. And as Christians, we don't have any trouble with that because we believe that's the foundational truth of the Christian faith, that love is self-sacrificing, and God showed that first to us through Jesus. But it's when the worldviews run off into directions that we can't support or we just find morally questionable, that's when we struggle. Every film has a worldview. Let's take a recent film, Dune 2. For example, Dune 2 has a very strong worldview about the manipulative place that religion can play in a culture to move people towards war. And so Paul Atreides, the hero, is tortured by the idea that if he's accepted as a messiah figure by the Fremen people on the planet of Dune, then that will lead to great destruction and interstellar war, and millions upon millions will die. And so what we're being presented there is the unquestioned worldview that religion leads to fanaticism, leads to violence, and we might be better off without that process. That's what our hero believes. And we're swept up in the story. We love the story, but the worldview's there nonetheless. It doesn't really matter what product we're talking about in terms of the media. So long as it's got a story involved in it, that story will have a worldview. And we need to become past masters to detecting those worldviews, or otherwise we're just sitting on a conveyor belt, eating what's placed in front of us and moving along according and being shaped by that.
You don't talk about this much in your article. I'm just curious, since you touched on it a little bit, but does Hollywood or like the greater filmmaking sphere go through trends where, okay, for 5-10 years, we're going to tell this story, or we're going to do away with that? That's like a nonsense kind of film. We're going to do something else, not just the standard, oh, everything's got to be superheroes now, or everything's got to be this, that, or the other thing. But are there ways that stories come in and out of vogue when it comes to the greater filmmaking sort of world?
Yeah. I think the worldviews that come through are fashionable, for want of a better phrase. So at the moment, we're caught up in a age of personal, individual meaning. So the idea is that you actually define yourself right down to the degree that you define your sexuality. And so you'll see a lot of characters emerging in films now who are gender curious or not quite clear on where they stand in relationship to male or female, or their attractions thereof. And that is an expression, maybe the endpoint expression, of the individualism we've been playing with for quite a few decades now. And so that's fashionable. But if you were to go back the last 10 years or so, you'd see a very strong environmental theme moving through films, that it is not enough to pay attention to feeding the hungry. They've got to be fed in a sustainable way. We need to take care of our planet in a way that recognizes the rights of other elements of the creation. And that's a very subtle way of thinking of moving human beings onto the same level as any other species. So behind that is something of an evolutionary format or worldview. So you can trace these things back as to particular flavors. There are some tropes, though, that continue to pop up every now and again. Like I said, on a positive phrase, there's the sacrificial trope. You'll see that we keep coming back to these stories as human beings, that we can't conceive of something more powerful than someone laying down their life for somebody else. And we see that laying down in a number of different ways. Somebody might devote themselves to a cause. Someone might offer themselves in terms of finances or even their physicality. Some people might actually die, offer their lives in the ultimate sense. So those sorts of stories keep coming along all the time. But yeah, you do see this sort of particular flood. I would go back a little further and say maybe 20 years ago, female empowerment was a very big theme that moved through. In the same way now that it's almost inconceivable of putting a script or storyline up into the mass media that didn't have a gender neutral, for want of a different phrase, character or a gay character or something like that. That's almost inconceivable to have a main storyline without that now. There was a movement, which we maybe say in a very positive way 20 years ago, where we started focusing on women as heroes so that they could actually step into the light and not simply be appendages to male storylines. These things can be good or they can be challenging depending on where you sit in your own worldview.
Yeah, one thing that I've definitely noticed in the conversation is the quote-unquote rise of the girl boss, the woman who is a hero in a way that many have said denigrates the role of men as a contemporary in the setting of the film, whether it be like a strong, capable woman. that sits opposite to a man who's just completely inept or whatever. Often there's a lot of rhetoric and back and forth between the roles of men and women in film. And I think there are some films that have treated that pretty well. I think maybe perhaps Barbie is a good example of a recent film that explored some of these ideas in a more considered and thoughtful way. But a lot of them do seem to be pretty hard on the quote unquote the message without doing much introspection about some of the perhaps darker sides.
I agree with you. I agree with you because I think that one of the problems of the age we find ourselves in is that there is more diatribe going on than there is reflection. The storylines that come out have a worldview and they create their heroes distinctly by contrast. So as you put it, if we're going to have a female hero at the center of the storyline, often the men have to be idiots in order to lift that, to make that contrast. But the same is true that if we're going to have somebody who's in favor of a more understanding approach to other people's belief systems, they have to be offset against bigots. If it moves into a sexual territory, sexual politics, we're going to have somebody who is going to be particularly fluid in their presentation of gender and sexuality. They have to be offset against often hardline religious figures who seem to have no sympathy or compassion for their situation. And so, to my way of thinking, there were films that were a little more nuanced. And you mentioned Barbie, and I think that Barbie is an outlier by comparison because in that film, there's initially a critique of the male-female relationship and how that women can be typified in a particular way, stereotyped. But then it moves on to how women can actually trap men into the same sorts of roles and how that's a problem for both sexes. So to me, that's actually an attempt to critique both sides of the argument. And that's a really helpful thing to do. But often, who would have thought that film was going to be more thinking than other sort of powerful blockbusters that came out at the same time? Yeah, I feel that you've hit the nail on the head there, that we're in an age of diatribe. It's not enough to present an alternate viewpoint. You must kill the opposition in order to make your viewpoint relatively strong. And I don't think that helps any argument. Going nuclear, as we sometimes call it in my family, doesn't actually leave anything other than burnt ground afterwards. There's hardly any relationship left. It doesn't matter who won. It's just broken relationship all around. In a society in which we ostensibly stand for compassion and understanding of other people's viewpoints, the last thing we want to do is demonize somebody else in order to get our own viewpoint across. And I think that that's a lesson for Christians as it is for unbelievers as well, that as Christians, we have got to be very careful that we don't just stereotype our opposition. We need to seek to understand their position and why they feel the way they do and what might have driven them to that particular viewpoint. Otherwise, how else can we winsomely put forward a case for our alternate viewpoint without being written off as vindictive people or hardliners?
Yeah, that's an important point. I'm glad you made that. Man, there are so many things that I'd like to, and I've got to restrain myself because there's so many little jumping off points in what you've just said that I really want to get into. But I'm going to restrain myself and maybe save it up for a future conversation. I think one of the things that people are going to really want to know, Mark the filmmaker, Mark the media critic, Mark the guy who gets to go to red carpet events or exclusive screenings, Mark the dad, when it comes to your role in the industry that you work in, what has been your approach or perhaps your experience as a father trying to raise kids, knowing what you know about the industry and about the people who make the stuff that we watch and that we engage with? How has that informed your parenting style? I know that's a very broad question, so
well, I want to begin by saying, I want to begin by saying that my parenting style is a two-person job. So I'm really thankful that my wife, who also works in the media, she's a producer, is in the battle with me in this. And I think that strangely, look, I know we're speaking to a mixed audience, people in different family setups, different experiences of relationship and things like that. But if you're in a relationship and you're parenting together with somebody, then you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't do these things together. You don't want to be at opposite ends of this process, one of you leaving the responsibility to the other one, which by default is actually just affirming whatever the kids want to do. So Maya and I, my wife Maya, have striven to try and ask ourselves again and again. One of the key questions we have for ourselves is we look around our family and we look at something that has started to emerge. Maybe it's the kids playing more video games, or maybe it's the fact that mobile phones have made themselves present in our household. And so we have to ask ourselves, where is this going? And do we like the end point? Do we? And if not, what are we going to do about it? But honestly, I'm not living in the today, as in, look, this is what I'm going to do today, or even this is what we have to do this week. But asking yourself, if this week became 5 weeks and 10 weeks and every week, where would it end? And what would be the natural result for our family? And would we be happy with that? And that's your very first starting point to identifying the sorts of things. Now, most parents actually are aware that something at least is happening with their kids' use of media, and they're vaguely aware of the currents and riptides that flow beneath the surface and tug their children one way or another. And they get glimpses of this sometimes, on which their kids might say, someone sent me a text, or I saw this on social media, or somebody commented to me, and they start to see the waves form, or they pick up the kids are using language which they've absorbed from the media, so they can see the evidence that there's this change going on. And I think we feel helpless. Now, I think that the sheer scale of the media today and its pervasiveness in our society makes the average parent feel like it is too big. I can't do anything. I can barely understand what it's doing to myself. And so how I'm supposed to prevent it from doing something to my kids, particularly taking them to that place I'm unhappy about, it almost feels like an impossible task. So I just want to start by saying, before we get into any of the what could you do's, look, my wife and I have been working in the media for more than 30 years now. And we would say without a doubt that we have made some catastrophic errors. You just say, oh, I think this is okay, or maybe we've left it a little longer than we really should have, some practice or something like that. And we're just like you, every other person listening in, we're trying to work it out. Now, we have some hints by virtue of working in the industry, but it's not as if some people out there have just got a cruisy ride and the rest of you are just trying to scratch away an existence out of this particular landscape. So let me just say, there are a lot of mistakes going on there, but let me share a couple of things. And one of the things I would say first off is that you have to teach yourself and your kids to detect messages. So they have to become active listeners when it comes to the media, active people who are digesting rather than passive listeners who are just absorbing whatever comes their way. And so this can start at any age, and you never have to have done it before to start doing it now. But the classic question we ask our kids, and our kids, some of them are in their 20s now, what do you think that was all about? What was that all about? You can fine tune that question. You can say things like, who do you think was the real hero in that story? Or why, and then ask why. But simply asking, what do you think that was all about, will start moving your kids to the position that these things have messages. That something is being communicated by that film, or something is being communicated by that program, or the 60-second video that they've had on YouTube Shorts. What is it? What is that all about? And so that presupposes something else too. And that presupposes that you are actually going to be aware of what it is that they're viewing. You may even, and this is the gold standard, participate in the media that they're digesting. Now, obviously, you can't be there all the time. So that's why you want them to be asking this question. What was that all about? What did that mean? What was behind that? Who was the hero? Why were they? You can ask other drill down questions too. Questions I like to ask of myself. What does this production tell me about good and evil? Are they real, or are they just matters of perspective? Or what does this film tell me about myself? Is it really all about me? In the end, does my home life and my job and my marriage even have to give over to what is good for me? And then you want to ask, well, what does this say about God? Does he even exist in this universe that's been painted? And if he does, what sort of God? Is he distant or is he close? Is he loving or is he mean-spirited? So what is that all about? Is the first question you ask and you teach your kids to ask. Because if they can see the message coming, then they are 10 times better able to choose whether or not they think it's a valuable thing or not.
That's super helpful. I think if I could just pick up on that, the other thing that you're teaching kids is that, and this might seem super basic to you, but I think for me it's quite profound. Media is communicating that media is worth having a conversation about and thinking about rather than just passively consuming. And when I think of all the kids in my life that I know, whether they're 2 years old or 12 years old, and the vacant iPad stare, which we're all so familiar with, I know for many of them, that's probably not even on the register. This is just something that I sit down and I consume, and I really don't understand why it's so compelling, because I don't have the thought processes to be able to work through that for myself, but I'm still yet getting sucked into this. And that's, I think, pretty scary.
Yeah, I think every parent who's engaged with particularly older kids and the media has been witness to that situation where they're very familiar with the tops of their kid's head because they're just bent over. Or I'll walk into our family room and there will be one of my sons crouched up in the fetal position on the lounge with his face buried into his phone. Like he can't possibly get any closer to it. But there he is swiping, watch, swipe, watch, swipe. And he must be digesting probably 20 films in a minute because he's not watching the entire thing. So he's engaged there. Now, that's what I'm saying, even as media professionals and knowing the power that those images have on kids, it's sometimes something that you really have to teach them and struggle. So can I actually say that there's some, oh gosh, I'm going to sound really retro now. If you were worried about my age before, listen to this. There's nothing like parenting to help this situation. Right. There's nothing like actually asserting yourself as a parent. One of the things that you have to become in your own household is a gatekeeper. And there is no popularity contest to be won here. I'm afraid that there will be points in which you just have to choose and say, look, our family just doesn't do that. And so you have to, so long as you can control things, and there's something to be said for that old phrase, while you're under my roof. But so long as you can exercise some control, you need to set boundaries because there will come a time in which you won't be able to exercise control, and you're going to hope that those boundaries were firmly built up in the time that you were able to exercise authority in your household. So a classic is, at our household anyway, is no phones at the table. If you're going to try and have a meal together, and that's something that any child psychologist worth their salt will tell you that it's fantastic for families to sit around and eat meals together. If you're going to try and do that, clearly you don't want distraction that's associated with a phone at the table where somebody's getting text messages or they're doing something that we call double screening. They're looking at you or they're looking at something that you're watching together and they're also on their phone at the same time. So we have some general rules in our household. No phones at the table, no double screening. If you're going to devote yourself to something, then consider it. Don't just be flipping between things all the time. I've seen my kids sometimes be having 3 different media sources going at the same time. And I tell them, look, that's not healthy. You're not actually drawing on anything, understanding anything. It makes me feel like an old man to say it. But we've got a parent, mum, dad, if you're listening in, we've actually got to be unpopular because that's what parenting is sometimes. It's actually putting up fences so that your kids don't hurt themselves. And so there are other things. You've probably heard these things in different places too, but parenting can take the form of restricting screen time, particularly while kids are younger and you have a say, restricting things. So you say, look, you're going to have screen time, sure, but you're going to have this amount of time. And something that is still, I've got kids in their 20s, as I said, and kids in their teens as well. But I have, at this age, I still have children who say, is it okay if I do this now? Now, they haven't been crushed. They've basically just understood that there is an order to things. So we do homework before we go online. I have had for the longest time with my boys, half an hour of reading will buy you an hour of screen time. If you do half an hour of reading, I'll give you an hour of screen time. Now, I have a limit
Sweet
to that,
deal.
obviously. Yeah, yeah. And I have a limit to that. Obviously, there's only so many hours in a day. But particularly on holidays, like trying to say, look, let's balance this out. Instead of you playing games, let's play a game as a family. We have this habit, which we've had for years now, where when we go on a holiday, we go to a game shop together and we buy a game. And so there's at least so for every holiday, I can count back. Now we've got too many games now, but for every holiday, I can count back. There was just a simple game we bought. Could have been Exploding Kittens or something like that, a card game like that.
Nice.
Or it could have been or Doctor Who strategy games. Gosh, the things you'll buy because your kids are interested in them. Like you'll play those games, and game time becomes something that's communal. So sure, they can have individual game time, but these sorts of things, you need to try and work out how, where is it going? Where is this thing ending? What are they fascinated with? Okay, they're fascinated with games, or they're fascinated with watching videos, or they're fascinated with television. How am I going to move that in a healthy direction? Something that we do, talking about kids just being fascinated watching television. I was talking to a fellow today. He was talking about his 2-year-old son, and he was saying that all his 2-year-old son wants to do is watch television. And I could understand that. It's an overpowering thing. Bluey has captured the hearts of a nation. So kids are very interested in watching Bluey. Parents are interested in watching Bluey. And there's the key. What do you watch together? So what do you consume together? So you can have these conversations. So, for example, we've been having a family show that we watch together for many years now. And you'd be surprised how interested kids can get in picking that show together. We're coming to the end of a particular Star Wars series that we've been watching together, Obi-Wan Kenobi or something like that. What are we going to watch now? What is the next thing we'll watch together? And there are votes that come in, and kids have varying things, but they also understand that if someone got to choose last time, then there's a bit of quid pro quo going on, and they'll have a chance to choose something later. But we're watching it together. So viewing becomes a communal experience, and we get a chance to have the conversation. As a holiday, Australians, I realize we've got an international audience for your podcast, but Australians are known for their viewing of films during holidays. Like our ticket sales at movies just spikes incredibly during holidays, and that makes a fair degree of sense. Parents and kids have time off, and there's just no reason why you can't think carefully about the film you want to take and plan to have a conversation. It might only be the 10 minutes in the car on the way home. But again, asking that, what do you think that was all about, or who the hero was, tells you where your kids' heads are and forces them to think for 30 seconds. And again, there are things that you can build into your family life that actually show you parenting and making choices which will make a big difference.
That is super practical. I want to drill down a little bit if we could. I know this probably might seem pretty overly obvious to most people listening, but I think it's worth having the conversation regardless. You've had kids grown up to teens, and do you say that you got some kids in their early 20s now?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So you've seen from newborn to now being a young adult. And I'm sure you've seen your kids' friends and family members grow up around different parenting styles. Some may be a little bit more strict, some a little bit less strict. Could you just, and I know you're not a neurologist, as far as I know, you're not a neurologist or
Not
anything
last I
like that.
checked.
So not like, okay, that's fair. So feel free to pass this on if this is a little bit too brain science sort of thing. But what's at stake here, Mark? Like beyond the worldview stuff, which is super, super important, but like in terms of the difference between a kid who grows up to become an adult, who grew up in a household where media consumption was moderated in some of the really helpful ways that you've outlined, obviously not perfect, versus the kid who grew up in a household where they could just watch infinite TikTok or sat in front of the TV like Bart Simpson every day, had an iPad glued to them wherever they went. What in your mind is the difference in the kind of person that comes out the other end, enters the workforce, becomes an adult, becomes a functioning member of society in those two situations? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. It does. Look, I'm going to offer some opinions here, and I want you to take them with the grain of salt that, as you say, I'm not a child psychologist or a neurologist, but the plasticity of the human brain has been something that has been discussed quite widely over the last, 20 years or so, ever since Norman Doidge introduced his book, The Brain That Heals Itself. We started to understand that we were actually capable of rewriting neural pathways. So just think of them as the roads that connect different parts of your brain. And we knew that we could actually excite ourselves with dopamine through particular vision, and that would actually drive us to go find that, lay down a neural pathway in our heads and drive our brains to find that excitement again and again, so we could get that dopamine hit again and again. And hey presto, what pops out the other end is porn addiction. So you're right in saying that our media habits have the ability to create a person, with of a particular type and state. So I want to say carefully that even though I'm not a child psychologist, I am aware that mucking around with media in an unthoughtful way is like doing brain surgery without thinking of the consequences, that
Wow.
we are going to affect ourselves one way or another. And I would say as much to ourselves as I would to our kids. I should have said earlier, one of the things that you're going to do if you're going to set up good, healthy habits and media habits in your household, you need to remember that you've actually got to be part of that process. You can't say to kids, no phones at the table, and then have your phone sitting on the table and just taking a call or just something like that. It just doesn't
Yeah.
work. Or you can't tune out and ignore the world in the way that you digest media and yet somehow try and change that in your own household. But look, what are the long-term effects? Let's put it this way. The long-term effects of social media, for example, are becoming startlingly well documented, so that social media and its concentration on images and the algorithms that bring up for you those things that you are constantly interested in, so that there's a self-reinforcement, there's a loop going on in which you're seeing the same things over and over again that excite you, or for that matter, that influence you. These things change our self-image, and our image of the world. So not just the world around us, but the way we see ourselves, not just our worldview, but our self-view. And when you've got Instagram basically having 40% of its audience under 22, you've got some kids in particular stages of life, particularly vulnerable stages of life, who are learning to see themselves a particular way. So much so that I refer to this in the article, so you can go back into the article and have a look at some of these statistics. But the connection between poor views of yourself leading to suicidal thoughts is well established now. So much so that I would think that social media is going to be looked on completely differently by, say, 2 or 3 generations from now. Or maybe if you want to think about the fact that we look back at the slave trade and say, how could people think that way, that people were not equal? I think 100 years from now, people are going to look back at social media and say, how could they think that was not going to be a problem? Or maybe in the way that we look at smoking now and say, look, how did they think that was not going to have long-term ramifications? I think social media is the smoking of our generation. It is actually going to be particularly dangerous, and it is already having that effect, those sort of negative effects on particularly young girls. And Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, they're aware of the studies are often conducted by their own R&D departments. So they're aware of the danger, and they're trying to do their best in some contexts to actually work against that. But you are shaping a person when you start using media in large and unadulterated content. So I would think that's something that we have to bear in mind. It's not passive. It is always active. It's always doing something. We just have to choose what it is we want to do.
I think it's Scott Galloway, the American academic, who talks about how, in his opinion, Mark Zuckerberg personally, and everything that he's represented has done more damage to the young people of America, and I guess by extension the world, than dancing, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or anything that could be considered a grave threat to teenagers, which is a pretty bold stance to take. But I think that, there's some truth to it.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we've got to bear in mind is that to not swallow the propaganda. You talked earlier about propaganda messages. Social media have their own propaganda messages, and that is that they unite people and empower people. Now, those two messages, that they unite people and they empower people, are seriously under question. To begin with, one particular study conducted by the Cigna Loneliness Index discovered that 71% of heavy social media users reported feelings of significant loneliness, not connection, but loneliness. That the more that they used these social media, the more they felt disconnected from the people around them. And you can understand how that might take place. Or the idea that it's about personal empowerment. There are people like the other studies, again, you can look in the article for this, but that have actually indicated that 6% of American users and 13% of British users on social media find that these are, particularly Instagram, have found that the image sharing apps have been responsible for them wanting to end their own lives. Now, there's not empowerment. That's somebody feeling so completely disempowered that they no longer feel like they have a reason to live. Now, this is not the total use of social media any more than murder is a total use of a knife. There are positive ways you can use media tools. There's no doubt about that. But we must be aware that there are a sharp edge to these things. Otherwise, we are really setting ourselves up for failure.
Yeah, and I think we have our own issues to deal with as individual people. But then when you bring a child into the equation and you're trying to protect them from the dark side of this stuff, it can be really difficult, especially when they have their own device and they have their own free will and autonomy, as well as social pressure to use a lot of these apps. So parents have got their work cut out for them.
They have. And I just might say to parents in general at this point, this can sound, as we warned at the beginning of this conversation, this can sound very disconcerting. I can feel powerless in the face of this. What do I do? Here's a guy on Science Radio telling me about how it's like brain surgery and smoking. And like, I might have just depressed you and you might go look for something fun to do instead of listening to me right now. But look, I just want to say you actually have a very powerful tool at your disposal. The media is only really powerful in terms of worldviews when it comes up against a void. The most powerful media message is one that says something about which a kid knows nothing. And this to be true. I use this example in the article, but it's true of many things. What do we know about the Napoleonic War? Really, and there'll be one or two of us out there who are Napoleonic War experts, but for the rest of us, what do we really know except what we learned from the film Napoleon? It's, or if you can go back a little further, the Master and Commander or other films. We didn't really grow up with any knowledge of those things. And so therefore, we're very happy to take as read that Napoleon Bonaparte had an inferiority complex just because the actors who play him make it clear that he did. So where there's a void, the media is particularly powerful. But that also means that if we fill in the void, we take away a lot of the power of the media. So as a parent, if you can actually give them a different worldview, you inoculate them of the worldviews that are being flooded through their media channels towards them. So, for example, and when we say this as a Christian perspective, if I spend valuable time in my life teaching my kids about the Bible and a view of the world that incorporates God and understands Jesus' role and relationship to me, I inoculate them against harmful media messages. So you might think to yourself, this is too big for me to do anything about, but here's the, as we used to say when we used to play cards, the lay down misere hand, that if you really want to do something that actually helps your kids with media problems, maybe you're not across device usage, maybe you're struggling to get them to listen to you, But if you give them a solid worldview to fill the void, which they have no worldview in, then you're actually doing the most positive thing that you can do in order to protect them from negative media influences and effects.
And I think that's super practical, super helpful. I think as well to point out from a Christian perspective, but not just from a Christian perspective, our community, the people that we spend time with, the people groups that speak words of affirmation and, again, that worldview into our kids. And I do think that this is where Christians really have a massive advantage over everybody else, because what other community do we have where you can show your kids how much they are worth, how much the creator of the universe loves them, and be part of a positive community that is not just there to tell them how great they are, but also there to help them to be able to become the great person that God's created them to be, to contribute, to grow. It's amazing.
Absolutely. And I would say that this community that you talk about in terms of the Christian community has tools which are aimed at affirming that particular worldview you described. So, and they're quite old-fashioned tools, but that's possibly because they've worked for generations. Inviting your kids to participate in church and encouraging them to do, even when it's not the most entertaining thing for them to do with their time, and going to youth groups and things like that. Where else are they going to sit down in this society today and actually think what they believe about the world? And listen to people talk to them about a positive view of the world, an affirming relationship between them and God. Where are they going to hear those things? But weirdly, it's the old tools that still help us deal with the new tools. So I'm a huge believer. My wife and I are big believers in trying to spend what we would call a quiet time with the kids. I call them kids. They're young men now. Ever since they were kids, we would try and spend a little bit of time each day, and boy, it's a fight. And I understand in any parent who is making the battle alongside of my wife and I, who are trying to find just a few minutes in a day to actually spend time talking about God with their kids. But gee, the payoff, the long-term payoff from the earliest ages, as the Bible might put it, teach a child in the way they should go, and when they're old, they will not depart from it. You teach them what is valuable. You teach them what is good. You teach them what is not good and what is damaging. And when it comes up in the media, they start asking their own questions. That seems to be different to what I grew up with. That seems to be quite, and this is not brainwashing on our part. This is actually showing them an alternate way to see the world rather than simply swallowing the one that is, as you put it, much closer to the beginning of this interview, the popular flavor that is being added at that particular time, the fashion that we're going through. They've got something a little more substantial. So again, if you're feeling overwhelmed about how to take your family through this media storm that they are confronting on a daily basis, really trying to find a way, it might sound counterintuitive, but trying to find a way to help them read the Bible or absorb biblical things is actually a fantastic way of dealing with an iPhone. It is just a wonderful way to deal with a PS5 or an iPad or any form of social media, is to actually fill in the void so that they're not ignorant of what they believe about the world and what you are teaching them to value, so that they can evaluate it when it comes along. When they ask a question of it, they've actually got some answers about whether or not they believe it or not.
And might I add to that? Not that I could add to what you've said, but we've got great cinema.
You're too modest. You're too modest.
All I was going to say is, look, we've got great cinema, but I grew up watching a little thing called VeggieTales, and that was pretty good cinema, if I might say so. If you're not a Christian, you're missing out.
Yes, and I might throw out just a hi-ho to my mate Colin Buchanan. However many parents have listened to Colin Buchanan CDs, you put them on and the kids learn Bible verses just by virtue of singing along to funny songs and things like that. I know this sounds very old school and low tech, but take it from somebody who is working with modern media all the time. It's at the base level. It's at the very simple base level where we inform kids about their worldview and what our view is as a family, that actually helps them much further down the track in their 20s make wise decisions, even when they feel somewhat influenced by the media messages that are being placed in front of them.
So good. Look, Mark, I think that I need to respect your time and the time of your families. Hey, thank you
Who are
so
probably
so
all
much
on devices right now, so I better go and stop them.
Yeah. Intervene.
Well, participate.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. You got to do what you got to do. Look, I really appreciate you talking to us. I really appreciate the article. If you want to go and read the article, you can, sciencetofthe.times.org.au. Thank you, Mark. We'll put a pin on it for now and we'll pick up the conversation in a little bit.
This is an Adventist Media podcast.